Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is Jon Ziomek. He is a retired Chicago newspaper reporter and freelance writer. Welcome, Jon.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. It's good to be with you.
Collision on Tenerife. How did you start on this project?
Yes, the crash itself, I wrote about the world's worst aviation disaster, two 747s that collided on a runway in the Canary Islands in 1977. And I met through a mutual acquaintance two people from Northbrook, a husband and wife, who had survived that crash. And the wife had written a very extensive diary about their experiences. But she wanted help from a professional writer to take things to the next level. That's where I came in.
I see. And 1977, that's over 40 years ago. When did you meet the Hopkins, and how long does this been?
Yeah, I met them sometime after the crash. It was more than a year afterward. And then we had extended discussions about exactly what we wanted to do, and then we finally got going on the whole project and decided that we had a book here. So, and I would do all the writing, but using Caroline's diary as the basis of everything. And it was right around then that my career started. I moved from newspaper reporting to journalism teaching at Northwestern. So I had this major freelance project going on, and I was getting a career going, and my children were being born. So I'm afraid things went a little slower than I had anticipated. And also I decided to keep interviewing more and more people. I wound up interviewing quite a number of the people who had survived that crash.
Wow.
And so everything kept taking longer and longer.
This crash and the interviews, were they Americans or are they?
Yes, the two planes, one of them was a Pan American Airlines. That airline doesn't exist anymore. But,
That's right, but I know
at
what.
the time, it was a chartered 747, completely full of people, mainly from the West Coast. Caroline and Warren were the only two people from Illinois, and not just Illinois, but from just a couple of miles from where we're sitting right now.
Yes.
But yes, everyone on the plane, on that plane, was American. The other plane, the one that actually hit the Pan Am plane, was a KLM plane, also a chartered. Both were chartered 747s. And that had flown from Amsterdam. The Pan Am plane had flown from New York, and before that from the West Coast. So I only interviewed Pan American people because everyone on the KLM plane was killed.
Oh.
And most of the people on the
tragic.
Pan Am plane were killed. But there were 61 survivors.
Out of?
Well, 583 were killed altogether.
Oh.
So, yeah, it was just
Devastating.
the actual event is just ghastly. But I wanted to interview other survivors to get other stories in addition to what the Hopkins has told me. And I added information about aviation safety. So I talked to FAA officials and National Transportation Safety Board officials. I went to Washington. I got the transcripts of the cockpit voice recorders.
Yes.
Which those are quite lengthy. Incorporated those in the book. These are all reasons
Devastating
why
to
it
listen
just
to.
kept
Right.
taking longer and longer. And then, some years after we started, Caroline passed away from an unrelated illness.
Wow.
And I just put everything away.
Yes.
I
And
thought,
it seemed,
okay, that's it.
Yeah, it seemed like that would be the end
Yeah.
of this project, wouldn't it? But how did it? Yeah, how
But
did it pick up again?
It came back partly because I threw away nothing. I saved every single piece of paper that I had. And a few years ago, my wife was cleaning the basement, and she said, "What do you want to do with these boxes over here?"
Notes, handwritten notes, I bet, from interviews.
Some were handwritten. Yeah, those were the days I worked on a typewriter, at least to start. So I had a look at what I had, and I admit I hadn't looked at this material for a long time, and I thought, this is good. This is useful information. Aviation safety is never not an issue.
Oh gosh, yes.
So I reactivated everything. I re-reported a lot of the safety information. Almost all of the survivors have since passed away, but some are still alive, and I made contact with them and got the whole project going again.
Now, aviation, it's been a part of your life personally too, right?
Yes,
Can you
all the
tell
way
us
since my birth. My father was in Air Force. He was in the Army Air Corps, as it was called then, during World War II.
Right, before Air Force was formed.
Before the Air Force was born. The Air Force came into existence the same year I was born, after World War II. My father flew for a while after the war, but then he stayed in the Air Force. He put in 20 years in the Air Force, and that was my childhood milieu. That's the way I grew up, on military bases,
yes.
and we moved around a lot. And
tarmacs and runways, and
that was part of my life. My father took me up in a small plane when I was about 7 years old and let me fly the plane for about a minute. And
wow.
I don't think we ever told my mother that.
That's the kind of story you don't want to let your mom know.
So I've always been interested in aviation, and when I spent almost 10 years at the Chicago Sun-Times, and I did aviation stories now and then. I had.
And so this collision must be like your worst nightmare, because you probably thought your father went on and off the plane every day, or routinely with no problems.
Yeah. By then, well, by the time of that crash, of course, I was way into adulthood. When I was a newspaper reporter, this is it's almost embarrassing to admit this, but reporters throw a lot of energy into the really big disasters, and we used to half joke about what would be the worst disaster where the entire newsroom would have to be covering it, and it did involve like planes colliding. And then when it actually happened,
yes,
with these two planes,
with so many deaths,
nothing was, that was just, of course, it was just ghastly. I mean, I had nightmares about it myself. And I wasn't even on the planes, but
right.
yeah, still, it was an extremely serious matter. And in fact, I did about 8 rewrites of the book drafts. Every single time I would get to the section of the book where the planes were getting close to colliding,
yes,
it was about to happen in the next few minutes, I would get almost physically ill as I was sitting there typing on my computer, just because I knew what was going to happen. And these poor people I was writing about did not know what was about to happen.
And your stomach just churns, and
I would get all knotted up. And then after the collision, then I was writing about people who had survived and had figured out ways to escape from the fuselage. This is only from the Pan Am plane. That's the only plane with survivors. Then it got a little more, I could calm down a little bit about it, because I was kind of mentally encouraging these people I was writing about to get the heck out of the plane, and they did.
So writing this book, you're reliving very realistically what they experienced.
I did, and it was over and over. Yeah.
Maybe we can read that, a scene from that. When the
Sure. There's, after the collision, the very first person to get off of the Pan Am plane was Warren Hopkins.
So he
from Northbrook. Now, he was among a number of combat veterans from World War II.
Oh, yes, of course.
Who had, they knew what it was like to be in a crisis.
Yes.
And be in emergency situations where they had to respond quickly.
Yes.
So that probably helped them. I mean, the trained crew, of course, on the plane, those, and many of them did survive the collision. They, of course, knew what to do because they'd been trained for it. But passengers, it's different.
Yes.
And but in Warren's case,
I think even in comparison now, look at our population now. There's so few veterans, and we would be in a worse way of handling this
that's
type
true.
of
But I
emergency.
did actually, I have some advice for people.
Oh,
This isn't
let's
just
talk about that later.
retelling,
Yes.
but yes, I do have advice for people who are nervous about flying. Okay, so after the collision, Warren immediately, I mean within seconds, he knew they had to get up. So, okay, here we go. "Let's go," Warren commanded, turning to his wife and touching her arm. She was still noticing the suddenly changed condition of the plane's interior. Shredded and curled wallpaper, the pastels and asterisks that airlines used in the 1970s to decorate their interiors, all of which suddenly looked like a child's papier-mâché project. It took Warren just a few seconds to unbuckle his seatbelt and move into the aisle, then step over debris that had landed there from the overhead compartments and from torn parts of the plane. He was now bleeding severely from the head because of a blow from falling debris. Caroline had not noticed her husband's injury because he had turned away so quickly, and even he wasn't aware of it because he was focused on what he wanted to do. Because of his proximity to the exit door, it was just 2 rows in back of him. Warren was able to reach it in only a few steps, even with debris in the way. He stepped to the door, or rather where the door had been. Not only was the door gone, ripped off its hinges, but the collision had also removed the entire door frame and surrounding parts of the fuselage section. A jagged outline of metal was all that was left to define that spot. There was no thought whatsoever of activating the emergency slide. He didn't see one or a lever to activate it. Assuming that his wife was standing right behind him, Warren hadn't looked back yet, he stood momentarily in what was left of the doorframe and looked out. The perspective was unique. Most Americans board planes through jetway tunnels and never see the outside of the plane, except through a window. Now, however, there was no platform and no stairway. The left side engines were still turning. Sparks were flying through the air from exposed electrical wires, and jet fuel fires were just beginning to crackle under both left side engines. The fuselage would soon begin to crack and sag down. Some survivors later would say they felt as if they were in a disaster movie, as if real life had suddenly become unreal. Indeed, the scene was Dante-esque. Gray fog was rolling in as orange flames shot into the air from underneath the huge silver wing that was now beginning to scorch and blacken. As he stood on his perch, Warren could see green grass and gray runway only a few yards away, demonstrating how close the cockpit crew had gotten to moving the plane off of the runway before the collision. Without the stairway in front of Warren to give him some perspective, the distance down to the ground was frightfully high, like jumping off the top of a barn, he would later say. The actual distance was about 20 feet. But with an urgency brought by the sight of the fire and the certainty that he must get away, Hopkins leaped into space. His body, with arms out and legs bent, flew in an arc out and then down, down until he hit the ground, miraculously landing on the balls of his feet, although more on the left than the right. The impact severed 2 tendons, bruised bones in his left foot. He fell to his hands and knees, losing not one shoe and his wristwatch from the physical shock of the jump, but not even noticing the sting of the landing. For several seconds, and what seemed like minutes, Hopkins was now alone on the ground and almost underneath the plane, which was beginning to generate flames and black smoke. He turned around and looked up, fully expecting to see his wife standing where he'd just been. She wasn't there.
John.
And in fact, no one was, and Hopkins felt terribly alone, standing next to the giant jet. "Caroline, Caroline," he screamed, trying to make himself heard over the still whining engines.
That is sounding very post-apocalyptic, like our futuristic movies. And
Yeah, yeah. Caroline did get out.
yes,
But there was
yes, it's
someone
her
in
diary.
between
Yes.
Warren and Caroline, the woman who was sitting in front of Warren and Caroline. She was with a friend. She'd been traveling with a friend who had encouraged her to get out. He stayed back to help some people. She got to the doorway, and Warren saw her and said, "Oh, jump, I'll catch you," which was very, very generous, but
Yes.
although not practical. She jumped and she landed right on his foot and hurt his foot even more
Oh
than it
my
already
God.
was. Then Caroline jumped and she missed Warren
Mm-hmm.
and landed on her shoulder and broke her shoulder. But they weren't burned.
Mm-hmm.
They got away,
Mm-hmm.
and they, all in all, they were physically, they weren't as badly hurt as many, many other people were.
Oh
So,
my.
yeah, it was, and it all
And
took place in just a few minutes.
just a few minutes. That's right. And
Right.
back in the 1970s, that's a very different time for us to even think of that, right? And
Well, it was in more ways than one. In those days, the airlines marketed themselves as being, oh, almost our friend. We're going to take care of you. If
well,
you can look at on YouTube, you can find them. You can find
yes. Well, the view of service is very different since the
the
1950s.
the
right?
whole thing is service.
Mhm.
And in fact, if you watch an old advertisement for an airline from that period or even earlier, I mean, you just start laughing after a while. You're getting, a meal on china and regular silverware, and it's so. But what that may have contributed to was kind of a passive sense by travelers, like the airline's going to take care of me.
Oh, yes. They don't have
And
a sense of, so yeah, personal responsibility, just waiting to be helped. Oh, that's very interesting because my neighbor who passed away in her 90s worked on the, I think the Silver Chief. They're the first class trains that went to the west.
No, yeah,
And
the Super Chief, right,
Super
right,
Chief,
the
yes.
old Santa Fe,
Right, and
right.
she was a nurse, and she saw. She said she showed us some of the advertisement where the nurses and the stewardess were expected to take care of your baby when you have a meal in the the restaurant cards. And I thought, wow, that kind of service is incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure that was the same type that translated over to the airlines.
I think it was a similar idea, and unfortunately, the result of that for at least some people on the Pan Am plane was that people just sat there after the collision, even though some people weren't hurt at all.
Right.
It was the collision was at an angle. The KLM plane was trying to take off.
Yes,
And did not see the Pan Am plane because the runway was very foggy
I see.
right then.
Mm-hmm.
Pan Am at the last second did see
And tried to
KLM
veer.
coming at it, tried to steer off of the runway, didn't make it, but the result was that the collision was on an angle.
Yes.
And more than, according to estimates by survivors, more than 100 people were alive and mobile
Yes.
after the collision. But how many, we'll never know. How many people said, I'm going to wait until they tell me what to do, and the result was they didn't get out of the plane.
Because
they
the
never made it out.
fuselage was still, or the
That's-
engine
in
was
parts
still
it was
running,
still
right?
intact.
Oh.
In other parts, no. I mean, some people were killed immediately. But so we had that passive attitude by some travelers. And then there is something that happens to the brain when we are suddenly in an emergency that we don't expect. The brain generates cortisol, which slows down your rational thinking.
Yes.
And there is a way around it. And this is really important advice that I have for anyone who gets on a plane. Just take a minute and look at the safety card and listen to the flight attendants. Traveling is safe, but
Statistically speaking,
statistically
flying,
it's
right?
very safe.
Safer than driving.
It's
Yeah.
true that bad things don't happen very often. They don't happen very often in restaurants either or theaters, but just taking a few seconds wherever we are in a big store.
Yeah.
Just
In
taking a few
school.
seconds, or in a
Yeah.
school. Just figure out where is the nearest emergency exit. It actually creates a pathway in your brain so that you can respond instantaneously if you need to. I've talked about this with neuroscientists, and they are all of one voice about this. If you know where you're going to go or what you need to do, it's just easier to respond in the remote possibility of there being an emergency.
So you mean the crew was giving instructions and
No, they weren't
no,
able to.
they
The public address system was
wasn't working?
smashed,
Yeah.
and most of the flight attendants did die in the collision. But there were 4 who were alive after the collision. They did beautifully, and they were doing exactly what they were trained to do. They were helping people get out. They were, explaining how to evacuate. The cockpit crew did the same thing. Everyone in the Pan Am plane cockpit did survive, and they, after they got out themselves, they went back and they helped people.
My.
So every single surviving member of the cockpit and cabin crew was given a big award by the National Transportation Safety Board.
Well
After
deserved.
that.
I don't
Well
want to
deserved.
take too much out of your book, but tell us a little bit how was it easy for you to find a publisher? If this was such an exciting story.
Well, it did take a while. I didn't have a publisher lined up when I was writing it. I figured I needed a presentable draft. And I did, on my own, try to find an agent, and that took months. So my sympathy is strongly with other freelance writers who are just on their own looking for people in the publishing industry, which is not what it used to be.
Yes, it's changed a lot.
It's
Yeah.
changed a lot. The publishers want big successes. They want Stephen King or someone who can sell books like that. I don't want this to sound cynical, but
Well, that's also why they say now is I think 70% of newly published books are through self-published or smaller publishers.
Well, then if that's true, I hadn't heard that, although I don't doubt it. But then I guess I got lucky because my publisher is Post Hill Press, which is a division of Simon and Schuster, and they do have national distribution. They're not doing promotion. That's up to me. So I guess I'm happy the book got published.
And you have a website, right? And
The
that
book has a
is-
website. I have a website or a page on Facebook for the book.
Yes.
And I've got an author page on the Simon & Schuster. I'm on Goodreads.
Yes.
And you can buy the book anywhere books are sold or just order it on Amazon.
So that
either
is
way.
through your publisher worked with Amazon to. You did not have to contact Amazon directly.
Right.
Right,
I
so that was
didn't
through
have to
the
do
publisher.
that.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And your website, was it easy for you to just set up a website, or did you feel like there's some tips you can give us, or did you learn as a group with a writer's workshop?
There are, I probably should have had some lessons first. There are some online services. You have to buy a domain name.
Yes.
So I didn't get creative here. I just went with the title of the book, collisionontenerife.com. But there are a couple of services where you can buy your name. I went with GoDaddy.
Yes. That's
.com for
okay.
that. And GoDaddy has a step-by-step process for authors who want to set up their own web page. I just did that. There are a few others that are they're basically the same.
Yeah.
I somewhat arbitrarily picked GoDaddy, but any of them are same idea. And they'll say, okay, do you want your page do you want to follow our template? And we'll help you, set it up. That's what I did. I just used the templates that GoDaddy
Well,
gave
that's
me.
helpful. That's helpful.
Yeah, it made it easier because this is, speaking as someone who, computers weren't a part of my life. They hadn't even come in
Yes,
yet
you
when I
mentioned
started.
it.
And
Your trusty typewriter.
my early days as a reporter were on a manual typewriter. that's the way it worked. So yeah, those things
And
are
I
different
still
now.
love the sound of that. So, John, you know other Glenview writers, do you?
Yes, this area is pretty strong in freelance writers and retired journalists like me. In fact, we meet occasionally we have a old timers lunch just down Lake Street a little bit
That's
every
nice.
single month. So yeah, well, the Glenview and the North Shore generally, I think, are just a very supportive area.
Yes.
It's a very supportive area for people in the creative arts like writing.
Well, thank you, John, for being here with us.
You are most welcome. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
And thank you. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.